On a rainy Tuesday night in Manhattan, Daniel Reyes carried his sleeping daughter through the lobby of Armitage Holdings headquarters. Her small arms wrapped around his neck, her backpack bumping against his hip with every step. He was 35 years old, a senior financial analyst with deep brown skin and close-cropped hair just beginning to show gray at the temples, and he had exactly 7 hours to complete a report that should have taken 3 days. The fluorescent lights above him flickered once as he stepped into the elevator, and Harper stirred against his shoulder, her dark braids brushing his cheek as she murmured something about pancakes. Daniel pressed the button for the 42nd floor and closed his eyes just for a moment, feeling the weight of everything he was about to lose if he failed. The office was nearly empty when he arrived, just a few junior associates scattered across the open floor plan, their faces illuminated by the pale glow of their monitors. Daniel found a corner desk near the window and carefully lowered Harper into an ergonomic chair, tucking his jacket around her like a blanket. She was 6 years old, with her mother's warm brown complexion and his own stubborn chin, and she had spent more nights in this building over the past month than any child ever should. He brushed one of her braids from her forehead and whispered that he would be right here, that everything would be fine, that she just needed to sleep a little longer. He had just opened his laptop when he heard the sharp click of heels against marble. Celeste Armitage stood at the end of the hallway, her silhouette framed by the city lights behind her. She was 31 years old, the youngest CEO in the company's history, a black woman with flawless dark skin and natural hair styled in an elegant twist, and she had inherited the position after her father's sudden death 2 years ago. Everything about her suggested control, from the precise cut of her charcoal blazer to the way she held her tablet like a shield against the world. She walked toward Daniel without greeting him, her dark eyes scanning the spreadsheet on his screen. "The Marlowe analysis," she said. "I need it on my desk by 6 tomorrow morning. Complete projections, risk assessment, and competitor benchmarks." Daniel glanced at the clock in the corner of his monitor. It was already 11. "Miss Armitage, I've been here since 7 this morning. The data you're asking for requires access to files that aren't even..." "Then get access." Her voice carried no emotion, no acknowledgement that he was a human being, rather than a machine designed to process her demands. "If you can't handle the pressure, Mr. Reyes, perhaps you're not suited for Armitage Holdings." She turned to leave, and her gaze passed briefly over Harper's sleeping form. For a fraction of a second, something flickered across Celeste's face, something that might have been recognition, or confusion, or even guilt. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, and she continued walking without another word. Daniel watched her disappear around the corner, his jaw tight, his hands trembling slightly as he returned to his keyboard. He thought about his health insurance, about Harper's upcoming dental appointment, about the rent that was due in 9 days. He thought about the promises he had made to his daughter and the ones he had made to himself, back when he believed that working hard was enough to guarantee a decent life. He began typing, and he did not stop. The weeks that followed carved deep lines into Daniel's face and stripped away whatever reserves of energy he had left. Celeste assigned him 2 additional projects before the Marlowe analysis was even complete, explaining in her clipped, efficient way that she was testing his capacity for growth. She scheduled meetings at 6 GOS in the morning and conference calls at 10 at night, always with the implicit understanding that attendance was not optional. Other employees whispered in the break room about Daniel's obvious exhaustion, about the dark circles under his eyes and the slight tremor in his hands, but no one said anything directly. They had seen what happened to people who pushed back against Celeste Armitage. At home, Daniel worked until the numbers blurred together on his screen. Harper sat beside him at the kitchen table, coloring in a book of dinosaurs, occasionally looking up to ask if he was almost done. He always told her yes, just a few more minutes, even when he knew it would be hours. One night, she asked if they could go to the park on Saturday, and he promised they would. And then Saturday came, and he spent the entire day on a video call with investors in Singapore, while Harper watched cartoons alone in the living room. He discovered the errors by accident late on a Wednesday night when he was cross-referencing data for a quarterly report. 3 separate miscalculations in a document that bore Celeste's signature. Mistakes that had somehow survived multiple reviews and were now embedded in the company's official records. Anyone else might have ignored them, might have reasoned that correcting the CEO's work was a fast track to unemployment. But Daniel had been raised by a father who believed that integrity was the only thing a man truly owned. And so, he fixed the numbers without telling anyone. He saved the corrected version and deleted any trace of the original, protecting the company from potential liability while asking for nothing in return. The early morning meeting was held in the glass-walled conference room on the 43rd floor, the one with the view of Central Park that Celeste used to intimidate clients and employees alike. Daniel arrived at 5:50 with Harper still half asleep beside him, her small hand gripping his as they navigated the empty hallways. He found a chair in the corridor outside the conference room and helped her settle in, promising that he would be right on the other side of the glass, that she could wave to him, if she needed anything. Inside, a dozen executives sat around the polished table, their expressions carefully neutral as they waited for the presentation to begin. The investors from Sterling Ridge Investments occupied the seats nearest the window. 2 men in nearly identical suits who spent more time examining their phones than looking at anyone in the room. Celeste stood at the head of the table, her posture perfect, her voice measured as she walked through the quarterly projections. And then one of the investors interrupted her. "There's a discrepancy in Section 4, he said, scrolling through his tablet. "The risk calculations in this version don't match what we saw in the preliminary report." The room fell silent. Celeste's face remained composed, but Daniel could see the tension in her shoulders. "I made those corrections," Daniel said. Every head in the room turned toward him. "The original calculations contained several errors that would have overstated our risk exposure by approximately 12%. I identified the issues during my review and updated the figures to reflect accurate projections." The investor from Sterling Ridge studied Daniel for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "That's exactly the kind of diligence we like to see," he said. "Miss Armitage, you've got a sharp analyst on your team." Celeste said nothing. She simply stared at Daniel with an expression he could not read, something between surprise and reassessment, as if she were seeing him clearly for the first time. The meeting continued, but she never quite regained her equilibrium. And when it ended, she left the room without speaking to anyone. Daniel returned to the hallway to find Harper still sleeping in her chair, her head tilted at an uncomfortable angle. He lifted her gently and carried her toward the elevator, wondering if he had just made the worst mistake of his career. The exhaustion accumulated like sediment at the bottom of a river, layer upon layer of sleepless nights and missed meals and promises he could not keep. Daniel's hands began to tingle during meetings, a pins and needles sensation that started in his fingertips and spread upward to his wrists. He developed headaches that no amount of aspirin could touch, dull throbs behind his eyes that made it difficult to focus on the endless columns of numbers. He lost 8 pounds in 3 weeks without trying. The autumn festival was supposed to be different. He had circled the date on the calendar months ago, back when his workload was still manageable and weekends still belonged to him. Harper had talked about it constantly, about the pumpkin painting and the hay rides and the caramel apples. She had picked out her costume, a purple witch's hat, and a cape covered in silver stars, and she had practiced her trick-or-treating voice in the mirror every night before bed. But the night before the festival, Celeste sent an email marked urgent, demanding a complete revision of the Marlowe acquisition files. The work would take 12 hours at minimum, and the deadline was Monday morning, and Daniel knew with absolute certainty that he could not do both. He tried to explain to Harper, kneeling beside her bed while she clutched her witch's hat and stared at him with eyes that were too old for her face. He told her that sometimes grown-ups had to make difficult choices, that he would make it up to her next year, that he was so sorry. She did not cry. She simply turned away from him and faced the wall, and he heard her whisper so quietly that he almost missed it. "You always say that, Daddy." He worked through the night while she slept, and by the time the festival was over, he had finished the revision and sent it to Celeste with 3 hours to spare. But when he went to check on Harper, he found her sitting on her bed with her costume still folded neatly in her lap, her eyes red from crying, and he understood that some things could not be fixed with apologies or promises. On Friday afternoon, Celeste called him into her office for a briefing on the Briarwood merger. It was supposed to take 30 minutes. It took 4 hours. When she finally dismissed him, she mentioned almost casually that she needed additional documentation by Monday, that he should plan to work through the weekend, that the company's needs had to come before personal considerations. Daniel looked at her across the vast expanse of her mahogany desk, at the expensive art on her walls and the awards on her shelves and the absolute certainty in her eyes. And for the first time in his career at Armitage Holdings, he said no. "I can't do it," he said, his voice steady despite the fear that coiled in his stomach. "I have a daughter who needs me. I've already missed her festival, her parent-teacher conference, 3 bedtimes this week alone. I'm not missing anything else." Celeste's expression did not change, but something shifted behind her eyes. Some recalibration of the assumptions she had made about who he was and what he would tolerate. "I see," she said finally. "We'll discuss this on Monday." She did not sound angry. She sounded curious. And somehow, that was worse. The little girl in the hallway could not have been more than 5 or 6 years old, with thick dark hair pulled into 2 puffs and a unicorn backpack that had seen better days. She was curled up in one of the leather chairs outside the executive conference room, her knees drawn to her chest, her eyes closed in exhausted sleep. A secretary walked past without glancing at her. A junior associate stepped over her extended legs without breaking stride. Celeste noticed her on a Tuesday afternoon between meetings with the board and a conference call with investors in London. She had seen Harper before, of course, had registered her presence in the same way she registered the potted plants in the lobby. But something was different today. Maybe it was the way the girl's hand clutched the strap of her backpack even in sleep, or the slight furrow in her brow, or the faded stain on her jacket that suggested a breakfast eaten too quickly in the back of a taxi. Celeste stood in the hallway for nearly a minute, watching. Behind her, she could hear 2 assistants whispering. "Poor thing's been here since 6 this morning," one of them said. "Her dad's in the Marlowe Review. You know how those go." "Someone should call child services," the other replied. "It's not right bringing a kid to a place like this." "Tell that to Armitage. She's the one working him to death." The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through something Celeste had kept carefully submerged. She turned and walked back to her office without speaking to anyone, her heels clicking against the marble floor in a rhythm that suddenly felt too fast, too sharp, too much like running away. That night, alone in her penthouse apartment overlooking the Hudson, Celeste opened her laptop and began reading. She pulled up every report Daniel had submitted over the past 6 months, every analysis, every projection, every hastily written email sent at hours when no reasonable person should be awake. She saw a man who had caught errors that 3 senior executives had missed. She saw a man who had worked through holidays and weekends and his daughter's festival without complaint. She saw a man who had given Armitage Holdings everything he had. And what had she given him in return? She closed the laptop and stared at her reflection in the darkened window, her brown skin looking almost ghostly in the dim light, and she did not like what she saw. The collapse happened on a Thursday in the elevator between the 42nd and 43rd floors. Daniel had just finished the final revision of the Briarwood report, 73 pages of analysis that represented the culmination of 2 weeks of work with almost no sleep. He had sent it to Celeste's inbox with a sense of hollow triumph, and he had gathered his things to go home and finally rest. He made it 4 steps into the elevator before his vision blurred. The world tilted sideways and his legs buckled, and the last thing he heard before everything went dark was Harper screaming his name. When he opened his eyes, he was lying on the cold marble floor of the lobby, surrounded by a circle of concerned faces. Someone had loosened his tie and propped his head on a folded jacket. Someone else was calling for an ambulance. And kneeling beside him, her designer suit forgotten, her careful composure finally cracked, was Celeste Armitage. "Don't try to move," she said, and her voice sounded strange, almost human. "Help is coming." Harper was crying somewhere nearby, great heaving sobs that cut through the ambient noise of the lobby like a knife. And then Celeste was doing something he never would have expected. She stood, walked over to Harper, and knelt down to meet her eyes. "Your father is going to be okay," Celeste said quietly. "I promise. I'm going to make sure of it." She took Harper's hand and led her back to where Daniel lay, and she stayed there until the paramedics arrived, her fingers wrapped around the small hand of a child she had never spoken to before that moment. The hospital room was small and white and smelled of antiseptic. Daniel spent 2 days there, hooked up to monitors that beeped at irregular intervals, while doctors explained that his body had simply shut down from exhaustion. Severe fatigue, they called it. Burnout. The kind of total systemic collapse that happened when a person pushed themselves past every reasonable limit and then kept pushing. Harper stayed with Daniel's neighbor, a retired teacher named Eleanor Price, who had helped out before during late nights at the office. Daniel called her every few hours, listening to his daughter's voice on the phone, promising that he would be home soon, that everything would be different now. He was discharged on a Saturday morning with strict instructions to rest for at least 2 weeks and reduce his stress levels significantly. The doctor, an older black woman with kind eyes, looked at him with an expression of genuine concern. "I mean it," she said. "Whatever you've been doing, it almost killed you. You need to make changes." Daniel nodded and signed the discharge papers and took a taxi back to his apartment in Queens. Harper was waiting for him at the door, her face pressed against the glass. And when he walked in, she threw her arms around his waist and held on like she would never let go. "I thought you were going to die," she whispered, "like Mommy did." He knelt down and held her, and he made promises he was not sure he could keep. The knock came at exactly midnight. He thought at first that he was imagining it, some artifact of exhaustion or medication, but then it came again, 3 sharp raps against the thin wood of his door, and he rose from the couch with a growing sense of unreality. Celeste Armitage stood in his hallway. She was wearing a gray wool coat that looked out of place in his building, and her natural hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and there was no trace of makeup on her face. She looked younger, without the armor of her professional appearance, younger and more uncertain than he had ever seen her. "I know it's late," she said, "and I know I have no right to be here, but I couldn't wait until Monday. I couldn't—" She stopped, took a breath, started again. "I need to apologize, and I needed to do it in person." Daniel stared at her for a long moment, trying to reconcile the woman in his doorway with the one who had driven him to collapse. Something in her expression stopped him, something raw and genuine that he had never seen in the polished conference rooms of Armitage Holdings. "It's midnight," he said. "I know. You're at my apartment. I know that too." He stepped back from the door. "Then you'd better come in." She entered his living room, her eyes moving across the second-hand furniture, and the crayon drawings taped to the refrigerator, and the small mountain of medical bills on the kitchen counter. In her hands, she carried a box wrapped in bright paper, and she held it in front of her like an offering. "I saw your daughter looking at this in a store window," she said, "about a month ago. I was passing by in my car, and I saw her standing there with her nose pressed against the glass. And I didn't stop. I should have stopped. I should have done a lot of things differently. Daniel took the box from her hands. Through the wrapping, he could see the outline of a stuffed animal, something soft and purple with what looked like wings. Miss Armitage. Celeste, she interrupted. Please, I think we're past professional titles at this point. Celeste. The name felt strange in his mouth, too intimate for what they had been to each other. I don't understand. Why are you here? Why now? She sat down on his couch without being invited, and for a moment she looked almost lost, like a woman who had spent her entire life navigating by a map that had suddenly become useless. I've been thinking about something my father told me, she said slowly. Before he died, when he was handing over the company, he said that the hardest part of leadership wasn't making decisions. It was living with the consequences of those decisions, even when you couldn't see them. She looked up at him and her eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. I made decisions about you, Daniel. About your time, your health, your relationship with your daughter. And I never once stopped to think about what those decisions were costing you. I just saw numbers on a spreadsheet, performance metrics, productivity reports. I didn't see a person, and I'm more sorry for that than I know how to say. The silence stretched between them, filled with everything that had happened and everything that might happen next. And then a small voice came from the hallway. Daddy? Who's at the door? Harper stood in her pajamas, rubbing her eyes with one hand and clutching her stuffed rabbit with the other. She looked at Celeste with the unfiltered curiosity of childhood. This is Miss Armitage, Daniel said carefully. She's someone I work with. She came to visit. Celeste rose from the couch and walked over to Harper, crouching down so they were at eye level. I came to bring you something, she said, and her voice was softer than Daniel had ever heard it. And to tell your father that I'm sorry for making him miss so much time with you. She reached for the wrapped box and held it out to Harper, who looked at her father for permission before taking it. The paper came off in excited strips, revealing a stuffed dragon with purple scales and iridescent wings, exactly like the one she had admired in the store window all those weeks ago. Harper's face lit up with pure joy. It's the dragon, Daddy. It's the dragon. She hugged it to her chest, and then did something unexpected. She stepped forward and hugged Celeste too, her small arms wrapping around the billionaire's neck with the unself-conscious affection of a child who had not yet learned to be suspicious of kindness. Thank you, she whispered. Celeste looked at Daniel over Harper's shoulder, a question in her eyes. He nodded. The next 2 hours were unlike anything Daniel could have imagined. He watched Celeste Armitage, CEO of a multi-billion-dollar corporation, sit on his daughter's twin bed and listen to detailed descriptions of every stuffed animal in the collection. He watched her examine crayon drawings with the same intensity she brought to quarterly reports. He watched her laugh at Harper's jokes, genuine laughter that transformed her face into something almost unrecognizable. When Harper finally fell asleep again, her new dragon tucked under her arm, Celeste and Daniel returned to the living room. The clock on the wall read 2:30 in the morning. I should go, Celeste said, but she made no move toward the door. You need to rest. So do you. She smiled, a small, tired expression that looked nothing like the polished mask she wore at the office. I don't remember the last time I rested. Not really. I think I've been running for so long that I forgot how to stop. Daniel sat down beside her on the couch, close enough to see the faint lines around her eyes, the vulnerability she usually kept so carefully hidden. Why did you really come here tonight? Because I watched you collapse, she said quietly. And I realized that I did that. Me. My expectations, my demands, my complete inability to see you as anything other than a resource to be optimized. I've spent 2 years running my father's company, and I've never once asked myself what kind of person that company was making me become. She turned to face him, and there was something in her expression that Daniel had never seen before. something that looked almost like hope. "I want to be different," she said. "I want to be the kind of leader my father would have been proud of. And I want to start by making things right with you." The morning after Celeste's midnight visit, Daniel woke to find Harper already up, sitting at the kitchen table with her new dragon and a bowl of cereal. She looked happier than she had in months, chattering away about how nice Miss Armitage was, how she smelled like flowers, how she had promised to come back and see the rest of Harper's drawings. Daniel listened and smiled and tried to quiet the voice in his head that warned him about trusting billionaires who showed up at midnight with gifts and apologies. But then he thought about the look in her eyes when she had held Harper, the genuine warmth that no amount of corporate training could fake. His phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Celeste. "I meant what I said last night. Can we meet tomorrow to discuss a new arrangement? Somewhere neutral. I have ideas." He read the message 3 times before responding. "Okay. Name the place." They met at a coffee shop in Midtown. Celeste was already there when he arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups in front of her, and she stood when she saw him, a gesture of respect that caught him off guard. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure either." They sat across from each other, and Celeste began to talk. She told him about growing up in her father's shadow, about inheriting a company she wasn't prepared to run, about the pressure she had put on herself to prove that she deserved her position. "I'm not asking for sympathy," she said. "I'm asking for a chance to do better. And I want to start with you." She pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. Inside was a proposal for a new position, a role that would give Daniel more autonomy, better hours, and a significant raise. There were provisions for childcare assistance, flexible scheduling, and a guaranteed minimum number of vacation days. "This is too much," he said, staring at the numbers. "It's not enough," Celeste replied. "Not after what I put you through. But it's a start." He looked up at her, searching her face for signs of deception or manipulation, and found nothing but sincerity. "Why me? You have thousands of employees. Why focus all this energy on one analyst?" Celeste was quiet for a moment. "Because you were the one who taught me that I was doing something wrong," she said finally. "When you corrected those errors in my report, you could have used them against me. But you didn't. You fixed the problem and moved on because you cared more about doing the right thing than about what you could gain from it." She reached across the table and touched his hand, just briefly. "I've been surrounded by people who tell me what I want to hear. People who are afraid of me or who want something from me. You were different. You told me no when I deserved to hear no, and you showed me what integrity looks like, even when no one's watching." Daniel thought about his father, about the lessons he had tried to pass down, about the importance of doing the right thing, even when it was hard. He thought about Harper asleep in her bed with a purple dragon. "I'll think about it," he said. Celeste nodded, and for the first time, she smiled. "That's all I ask." The weeks that followed were strange and uncertain. Daniel returned to work on a modified schedule, his hours reduced, his workload manageable, his weekends once again his own. He picked Harper up from school in the afternoons and took her to the park on Saturdays and tucked her into bed every night without the weight of unfinished reports pressing against his chest. And Celeste changed too. She held fewer meetings, delegated more responsibilities, started leaving the office before sunset. She asked her employees about their families and remembered their answers. She apologized publicly for the culture of overwork she had created and announced new policies designed to protect her staff from the kind of burnout that had nearly killed Daniel. Not everyone believed her transformation was real. Rumors circulated through the office, speculation about her motives, her sanity, her secret agenda. A few even claimed that she and Daniel were having an affair. The gossip reached Daniel through sideways glances and conversations that stopped abruptly when he entered the room. But the whispers made him question every interaction with Celeste, every smile she gave him, every moment of kindness he had started to believe might be genuine. One afternoon, he confronted her about it. "People are talking," he said, standing in the doorway of her office. "About us, about what's really going on here." Celeste looked up from her laptop. "I know," she said. "I've heard the rumors. Does it bother you?" She considered the question for a moment. "What bothers me," she said slowly, "is that you might believe them, that you might think everything I've done was just manipulation or performance or some kind of elaborate game." She stood and walked around her desk, stopping a few feet away from him. "I don't care what anyone else thinks. I care what you think. And if you've started to doubt—" "I haven't," he said. And he was surprised to realize it was true. They stood there for a moment, the space between them charged with something neither of them was ready to name. In the months that followed, they built something gradual and real, a foundation of trust and understanding that grew stronger with every conversation, every shared meal, every evening spent watching Harper play with her purple dragon. Daniel accepted the new position Celeste had offered, along with the better hours and the child care assistance, and the promise of a life that was not defined entirely by work. The day Celeste asked Daniel to bring Harper to her apartment for dinner was a milestone neither of them acknowledged out loud. They sat at her massive dining table and ate pasta that Celeste had made herself, and Harper talked about her school and her friends and the new drawing she was working on. "I want to show you something," Celeste said after dinner, and she led them to a room at the end of the hallway. Inside was a space that had been transformed into a child's paradise, a canopy bed covered in fairy lights, shelves filled with books and toys, a corner set up with art supplies and easels and every color of crayon imaginable. And on the wall, in a simple frame, was one of Harper's drawings, the one she had made of the three of them together, stick figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun. "I had it done last week," Celeste said quietly, "in case you ever wanted to stay over." Harper ran into the room with a shriek of delight, exploring every corner, examining every detail, her joy so pure and uncomplicated that it brought tears to Daniel's eyes. He turned to Celeste, and she was watching. Harper with an expression he recognized because he felt it too. "I don't know what this is," he said, "what we're becoming, but I know I want to find out." Celeste smiled, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "So do I," she said. "However long it takes, whatever it looks like, I want to be here, Daniel, with both of you, if you'll have me." He answered by taking her hand, and they stood there together, watching Harper dance around her new room. And for the first time in a very long while, Daniel Reyes believed that the future might actually be something worth looking forward to.